touched on a lot of issues, specifically the nexus of race, culture, and you spoke a bit about identity. I wanted to discuss a bit about the story of the average African American in the United States who is not aware of his or her roots and does not have that background to rely on or that immediate homeland to call home. How were you able to reconcile that with your African American friends growing up in the United States? And how do you see the difference growing up with an identity that you can call part of your own as an American?
In this novel, the narrator, who comes from Ethiopian parents, he's born in America. He has some small similarities to me. My life is fortunately much happier than his, but he's married to an African American woman, and they have a kind of similar histories in the fact that the narrator's father, when he comes to America, ends up after that experience of journeying through Africa and through Europe, is quite a sort of violent man. He sort of takes that sort of political violence that he experiences through migration and through the kind of wars in Africa, and it ends up becoming a domestic violence. And so the narrator grows up in an abusive household. And Angela, who's his wife, is African American. She grows up poor and often alone. And yet she becomes a lawyer, and she sort of is quite successful in her career and in her life. And I think for me, with the biggest difference, I mean, there's one similar thread, which is that sort of African American or African, we all have this similar experience of being sort of black in America, and that provides sort of common reference points. But the big difference, of course, is history. African Americans, or African immigrants like myself, we're fairly new to America. I mean, we really are 30 years. Roughly. I mean, there's always somebody who came a bit before. But by and large, it's an immigration that's only been happening since the late 1970s and the massive numbers that it's happening now. And we come in a sort of, with the benefit of having the civil rights movement already completed. And we come with the benefits of arriving as immigrants, with the idea that America is sort of an open place. My parents had no understanding of what racism was because they were Ethiopian. Ethiopia, who are you going to be racist against besides other Ethiopians? And yet when I went to school, I went to a very small private high school that was all white. And so I was the only black kid in most of my classes, and it was openly racist, to the point my teachers didn't even turn their head if I was getting into a fight with somebody. And so my parents couldn't understand quite how that frustrated, and it was kind of ended up defining my identity, because it defined my present sense, but then that historical identity still remained intact, because there was obviously a country that I could hold on to as a place. There's a sentimentality, because it's actually not real to say that I could hold on to Ethiopia. I'm more and more sort of, aware of how American I am, especially not living there. But the difference, I think, is how that legacy is transmuted generation to generation. And we all have cultural heritage. And so to think that just because the color of our skins are the same, that we all have the same cultural heritage is absurd. We all have the same cultural experiences at times, but somebody coming to America from Vietnam and somebody coming to America from North Korea, there's more similarity there, but we choose another non-communist nation. But you understand what I'm saying. It's not just purely a matter of color, it's a matter of history.
I think it would be so easy just to paint him as kind of, as you said, just kind of a violent person. I mean, he beats his wife, but I wondered if you could talk, because he doesn't come across that way at all. He comes across as very much a three-dimensional kind of tragic character. And I guess more than anything, was that your intention, and how did you really expect or think you should, I guess, come across?
I think like, as I said earlier, the narrator's father is a violent man, and almost like anything, you almost want to rescue him from that violence, because if he just was a violent man, then he exists purely in that state of violence. There's very little complexity to that, if that's all the sides of him that I could present. At the same time, it's the only side that the narrator sees as a child, is that sort of violent man, and so the complexity that I think hopefully is there with him is a complexity that's by and large invented by the son. It's a complexity that the son actually has to create for himself because he understands that there is this sort of complicated person. It's not just pure tragedy behind this man or just pure violence. There is a real human being with an experience that he has to come to terms with. And since the narrator's father is dead, he invents that history for him. And I think that active imagination it's part of what I do as a novelist, is I invent my own life, I think, oftentimes as I'm writing. But I think it's also to create, for him, this character that he feels is real. And the sort of second part, which I didn't talk about early at the beginning, is that other parts of this book take place or were sort of borrowed from my work as a journalist in Africa, which almost always revolves around sort of conflicts. And so just before I began this book, I'd been in Sudan and Darfur and in Chad and then in northern Uganda and in Congo for the kind of 2 years before this book began. And I began that process of journalism because I was kind of frustrated by representation of violence in general in Africa. You read a story about a war and it comes off as the horror, the terror. God, it's so awful and these people are miserable and they're dying, which is of course true. There is violence and terror, but those terrors are created without much complexity or depth to them, both from the people whose stories you're supposed to be hearing. You only hear about them in such a very limited, confined representation. And then the political context that makes those wars occur. They exist in a context, not just in a sort of like, hey, we're all angry, tribal, violent people attacking each other. There's a real political history behind each one of those conflicts that has to come out, be understood. And so the father for me was kind of my half-feeble attempt trying to see how much all of those can be sort of brought together. Both the character who is, in this book, there's less of a direct engagement with sort of politics in Africa as there was in the first one, but still a character sort of rising, emerging out of that with, I hope, more than just a kind of one-dimensional, I'm angry, I'm sort of a product of violence, I'm going to beat my family now sort of narrative.
To what extent do you think the cultural identity of a person is important as opposed to the similarities that are between human beings? And aren't we giving too much importance to where do you come from, just to define the person?
I think, I always think that obviously in the end of the day our cultural differences are really quite feeble, and they're quite marginal. At the same time, I don't deny the value. Culture gives us our identity, gives us shape, character. I don't want to live in a world where we're all the same, where we all speak the same, where we all think, eat, like, dress, have the same religion. That would be an awfully boring place to live. I also don't I'm sort of very frustrated with the idea that we have to learn how to tolerate differences in each other's cultures. That seems to be like the weakest thing that we can do, is to tolerate each other. Like, I can tolerate somebody playing really bad music, or I can tolerate bad food. I don't want to tolerate another human being because they're different from me. It seems more compelling to ask, well, how can I kind of, one, understand that they're a real person? And I think that sounds quite simple, I know, to say that, but I think that actually is quite an engaging, difficult task to take somebody and see them in a sort of full complexity as being, because it often means seeing somebody whose differences and opinions you hate, and whose perspectives you really can't stand, and understanding that they are not, one, just the totality of those experiences, but that there is still going to be something human about them that you are obliged to acknowledge, and acknowledging that, I think, reflects back on your own humanity. I think that makes you feel, I don't want to say connected because that seems so cheap, but it's harder to dismiss somebody that way. It's harder to kind of throw them aside and say that their opinion, their life, by extension, doesn't matter. So I'm all for cultural distinctions, divisions. I want those divisions to exist in many ways, but I think I want them to exist as not as barriers, but as sort of, opportunities.
Can you tell us a little bit about your writing process? So how you were able, linearly, did you decide that you were just going to keep going? I mean, how did it happen?
One night, 6 weeks. No. Not even. It's like that. I love writers who have those stories. Like, I woke up one day and I had a dream, and the dream was. No, it's a good. It's a sort of a great like battle that goes on between me. This book is probably about 3 years of writing, and most of that time now, I write full time now. I now have also 2 small kids, which means I write in random bursts whenever I sort of can. But fortunately, they were just being born when this book was. The first one was being born just as this book was finished, and that was a great deadline. I was like, I have like 6 weeks. That was like literally 6 weeks to finish. But by and large, when I'm working well, I work every day from once the novel kind of takes shape and form, which it takes me normally probably about a year before I actually feel like this book actually deserves to be a book, that it's actually a book and not just me wasting a year of my life in front of a computer. And then after that point, then I generally move forward. I have no plan, no vision. I don't have a plot, oftentimes, which is sometimes my failing. But the book, I just trust the book to kind of take place chapter after chapter. And over the course of those years, when it is done, this novel and the first novel, they have alternating chapters. So the structure is quite not tricky, but it's quite complicated. And that took 6-7 months of actually putting this novel together in place. Even though it was written chronologically, the chapters still had to have they had to echo each other properly, and they had to, for me, break in the right place for the reader to not feel completely disjointed and lost. Fortunately, I have a good editor who I worked with quite long on that process. But and now the next book begins sort of very much the same way. Yes. The title in French, Ce qu'on peut lire dans l'air, it works okay, but there's no easy way to title this put this into French. Comment lire l'air doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make sense sometimes in English. But I'll read just. There's a brief passage from a poem by a German poet named Rainier Marie Rilke that he wrote from